Thank you. I'm a science journalist, but my talk is going to be more about the journalism than about the science. And by the end of it, I hope you'll understand why. So, New York, 1851. That's lower Manhattan, into which almost all of New York's 500,000 residents were crammed. It's a small space for a lot of people. New York was the biggest city in the country, second place Baltimore. And it was a very new and raw place to be. There were no electric lights. Sanitation was terrible. Tallest building, a church spire. The streets were roamed by pigs and by gangs with names like the Dead Rabbits and Roach's Guard. It was not a safe place where people would venture out at night. The news business in those days was just about as raw as the city. There were no telephones, no electric lights, there was a telegraph, but it was new, quite expensive, hard to link up to. News came to New York and its newspapers by Pony Express, by ship, by local reporters, the original ink-stained wretches, who were ill-paid and tended to get their scoops in saloons. New York had many newspapers. Most of them were born and died within a matter of months. Back when the New York Times came along in 1851, and the New York Times in its present form, it was the 8th newspaper to have that name, the New York Times. Most of them had died within weeks and months. So it was not a very promising place in which to be a newspaper person. Enter a young man with very big ideas. Henry Jarvis Raymond was a 31-year-old former child prodigy, brilliant orator. He came to New York in 1840 with nothing but the clothes on his back. Managed to hook up with the famous editor Horace Greeley, worked for several newspapers with Greeley. Then he was a brilliant orator. He went into politics, got himself elected to the New York State Legislature, and while still in his 20s, rose to become Speaker of the State Assembly. But he figured that he could have more influence as a newspaper publisher. And he saw an opening, because in those days, as I said, the news business was chaotic. The two biggest papers in New York City, the Herald and the Tribune, one was a kind of sensationalist rag, the other was socialist. So Raymond saw an opportunity for what he called a conservative newspaper. And conservative had a slightly different meaning in those days from what it has today. The synonym we might use today would be respectable. So Raymond proposed to start up what he called, I'm quoting, the best and cheapest family newspaper in the United States. A newspaper that would, quote, substitute cool and intelligent judgment for passion. It wasn't easy. The first issue of the New York Daily Times was put together in a building that was so new and so raw, like the city of New York, that the windows didn't even have glass in them. This was a problem because the newspaper was put together at night by candlelight, so the wind would blow through the glass and through the windows and keep blowing out the candles. But Raymond was as good as his word, and one of his innovations was to charge less than his competitors. He figured if he could bring readers along by charging as little as possible for his newspaper, advertisers would follow and would paid the major costs of putting up this newspaper. The newspaper had a single press. It was kind of cranky and unpredictable. As you can see, the quality is not great. But his newspaper caught on. And his first issue was sold, his first penny a copy issue was sold to 10,000 people. By the end of 1852, the first anniversary of the New York Times, circulation had risen from 10,000 to 24,000, and the New York Times was on its way. Okay, let's fast forward 45 years. Here we are, Lower Manhattan again, but as you can see, it's growing. It's spread, gone all the way up to Harlem. North of Harlem is still farms and forests. But now there are 1.5 million people, 1.5 million New Yorkers, or 2.3 million if you count Brooklyn, which was then still a separate city. Much the biggest city in the country. Baltimore was out of the running by then, the second biggest was Chicago, but New York was still was the most important city, if not just in the United States, but perhaps in the world. It was becoming a financial capital. They were beginning construction on a subway. As you can see, the Brooklyn Bridge had been built. So New York was becoming a powerhouse. And the New York Times was still around, now selling for 3 cents a copy, but it was dying. Henry Raymond's successors had made a series of bad business decisions. And on top of those business decisions, the newspaper had taken a principled stand that Henry Raymond would have been proud of if he was still alive. In 1884, they abandoned their traditional support of the Republican Party and endorsed a Democrat for president, Grover Cleveland, over a Republican machine politician named James Blaine. Cleveland won, but all of the Times' Republican readers, many of them, deserted the paper en masse. They just gave up their subscriptions. Advertisers went away. Then in 1893, there was a terrible financial panic, the Panic of '93, and the Times lost even more revenue. So in 1896, the Times circulation was down to 9,000 copies a day. There were 15 newspapers in New York in those days. The Times was number 14 in circulation. It was losing $2,500 a week, and it looked to be the next casualty of the newspaper wars. Well, enter another young man with big ideas. Adolph Simon Ochs, O-C-H-S. He was 38 years old in 1896, born the same year as Theodore Roosevelt. He was although he was 38 at the time, he had been a newspaper publisher for almost a decade down in Chattanooga, Tennessee, very successful there. He went to New York on business and came home with stars in his eyes, like that Frank Sinatra song. He wanted to be a part of it. And like Henry Raymond, 45 years earlier, he saw an opening. There was the New York Times, still with a reputation for being reputable, respectable, probably the most respectable paper in New York, only it was hemorrhaging money and was about to go out of business. Well, Adolph Ochs thought maybe he could buy it. And sure enough, there weren't any other buyers. Nobody else wanted to take a chance. Ochs mortgaged his printing plant in Chattanooga for $75,000 and paid that money to acquire the failing New York Times. He had an idea very similar to Henry Raymond's. He wanted, he didn't use the term conservative, but respectable was still very much on his mind. And after he bought the Times in the summer of 1896, he wrote a manifesto, went on the front page of the paper, to give the news impartially, without fear or favor, regardless of any party, sect, or interest involved, to invite intelligent discussion from all shades of opinion. Well, in this day and age, that sounds pretty bland and like something anybody would say. But in 1896, it was revolutionary. Papers belonged to political parties, political factions, or business factions. So the idea that a newspaper would be independent of all that, except on its editorial page, was remarkable. Al Fox had another idea, borrowed from his predecessor Raymond, dropped the price of the Times from 3 cents a copy back to a penny, and began publishing without fear or favor. And once again, the Times took off. From a circulation of 9,000, the circulation tripled within a year. And again, the Times was off and running. I don't know if you could call Ox a child prodigy like Raymond, but he's definitely the hardest working person I've ever heard of. He worked 20-hour days for months on end to get this failing newspaper back off the ground. He was a Roman candle. His mind was like a Roman candle with ideas. Just had ideas bursting off of him. He had a gift for surrounding himself with equally creative and talented people who wanted to work as hard as he did. He came up with the idea for a Sunday supplement, which is the forerunner of today's New York Times Magazine. A Saturday freestanding book review. A Sunday weekend review section. And he had one other gift to give to the Times and its readers. His daughter, Iphigene. Iphigene Ox grew up to be a bright, very formidable woman. She was still alive when I came to the Times in 1989. In this day and age, today she would undoubtedly have succeeded her father as poet. But that wasn't done in those days very much. She married a wealthy World War I infantry officer named Arthur Hayes Sulzberger. And when Adolf died in 1935, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger became the publisher. And it is the Sulzberger family, as some of you probably know, who are still in charge of the Times today. This is the family that has kept the slogan, all the news is fit to print. By the way, that slogan was thought up by Al Ox himself, one of his ideas. He held a contest to come up with a better slogan. And there were thousands and thousands of entries from all around the country, but nothing that he and his compatriots liked better than all the news that's fit to print. So they put it on the flag next to the New York Times logo, and it's there to this day. Thanks again to the Sulzberger family, which continues to own the paper still. The publisher is Arthur Ox Sulzberger Jr., the great-grandson of Adolf Ox. The Sulzberger family is, I think, unique or almost unique in journalism. They believe that the Times is a public trust, it should be operated for profit, and always has made a profit since those early days. But that money was not the first consideration. The first journalism. And that brings us to one final fast forward, 2015. Once again, the Times is done. Well, not quite. But it is, if you look at the trends, the business trends in the newspaper industry. I hate to use the word, the term business model, but we have a business model that was handed down to us. It was developed by people like Henry Raymond in the middle of the 19th century and refined by people like Al Box at the turn of the 20th century. And I'm afraid it's obsolete. Those are newspaper advertising revenues. That's the entire industry. I don't have separate figures for the Times, but you can be pretty confident that the Times pattern is similar. Back in 1950, it's a kind of steady ascent with a couple of national recessions in there to a plateau in the year, but to a peak rather, a summit in the year 2000. That's the year of the dot-com bubble and bust. So advertising revenues plummet, and then start to rebound again in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. So what happened? Why that steep downward line? Well, the first thing to understand or to remember is that the business model for newspapers, almost all newspapers, is circulation and advertising. Charge as little money as possible as you can get away with. Bring as many subscribers and readers in as you possibly can. Advertisers will follow. They'll pay most of the bills. So from 1950 to 2000, pretty much everything is rosy. Then in the middle of the of the previous decade, in about 2005, along comes Craigslist. Suddenly, all the classified ads that newspapers printed, this was always a cash cow for newspapers. Almost all of those classified ads were help wanted, apartments for rent, used cars for sale, gone. Almost overnight. Then comes the financial crash of 2008, and meanwhile, along comes Amazon, which blows many, if not most, bookstores out of the water. They're gone, and so is their advertising. Very lucrative for newspapers. And Google, with its targeted ads. Every time you do a Google search, you can look for a vacation or a new car or a refrigerator. All of those things coming out of the newspaper's bottom line. That little blue squiggle at the bottom, that's online advertising. Here's a closer in look at the trend just from 2003 to 2012. It's the last year for which I could find figures, but I can promise you that the numbers are not rising. I don't know if you can see it, but the little darker part of those bars is online advertising. Online advertisers just will not pay to advertise on newspaper websites. Not sure why. Works for Google, but it does not seem to work for us. Nobody's figured out why that is. But it's a big problem because as long as the online share of our revenue is that tiny little squiggle, we're not going to be able to make as much money as we need to sustain our journalism. Okay, why should you care? Newspapers are nice to hold. You can take them to Starbucks with you. but fewer and fewer people are reading them. I venture to guess that the young people in this audience don't regularly pick up a daily newspaper. But what does it matter? If it's information you want, if it's news you want, there's plenty of places to get it. Heaven knows. There's cable news. There are online news sites of every size and shape and partisan information. There's social media. There's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of them with more information than anybody knows what to do. So what does it matter if newspapers go out of business? Well, it's not really about the newspapers as far as I'm concerned. It's about the journalism. Because somebody has to organize all that information, filter it, refine it, make sense of it for ordinary people. If there is nobody to do that, then you're on your own. You're out there in a little boat in a tsunami of information. How do you make sense of it? Well, this is the role that we have traditionally assigned to journalists. Now, there's lots of problems with journalists, and I don't make any apologies for my profession. But if journalists don't do it, somebody else has to do it. And nobody knows who somebody else is going to be. And if somebody else doesn't do it, and journalists are left to do it, then journalists have to earn a living and have to be paid. That's why these numbers are so alarming. Now, the New York Times and other publications have had some success by abandoning the traditional model of advertising in favor of charging readers to read the paper online. And the Times has had quite a lot of success with this, and so have some other publications. Mostly have not had as much success as the Times. But even that, all of that revenue, those of you who pay $15 a month to read the Times on your mobile device or your iPad, it's a lot of money, but it is not replacing that lost advertising. So, we've got a big problem, and nobody, I'm here to tell you, nobody has figured out how to solve it. No wonder the vultures are circling the website. Does my heart good to read that. So, Henry Raymond and Adolph Fox have left us with a great institution and a great idea. Independence, news, opinion, presented without fear of favor. But how's it going to continue? I'm afraid nobody knows the answer to that question. Personally, I think the New York Times will survive. I think it has to. It's just too important an institution to fail. There's too much support for it, too many people want it, and too many journalists like me care very deeply about it. Somebody will figure this out, but it hasn't been figured out yet. For the young among you in the audience, I really hope they do, even if the printed paper goes the way of type set by. Thank you very much.